The sterile, white-tiled walls of the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office morgue reflected the cold, unforgiving glare of the overhead fluorescent lights. It was a light that bleached color and warmth from everything it touched, reducing the world to shades of steel, porcelain, and shadow. Dr. Eris Thorne felt the chill not just on his skin, but deep in his bones, a familiar companion after 15 years in this subterranean kingdom of the dead. It was just past 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in the heart of a brutal Chicago winter. Outside, the wind howled through the concrete canyons of the city, but down here, the only sound was the persistent, low hum of the refrigeration units, a mechanical choir singing a constant dirge. Eris ran a hand over his tired face, the faint rasp of his stubble a reminder that his shift should have ended hours ago. A mountain of paperwork sat on his metal desk, a testament to the city's relentless mortality. He was initialing a report on a GSW from the South Side when Ben Carter, one of the newer morgue technicians, pushed open the heavy steel door to Autopsy Suite 3. The door hissed shut behind him, a pneumatic sigh of finality. "Last one for the night, Doc," Ben said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet room. He was young, barely 25, and still possessed a nervous energy that Eris had shed decades ago. He hadn't yet learned that the dead demanded a certain reverence of silence. Paramedics just dropped her off. Jane Doe found her in an alley off Michigan Ave, behind one of the high-end boutiques. Eris didn't look up from his paperwork. Cause? Exposure, they think. Core temp was, well, there wasn't much of one to read. No obvious signs of trauma on the initial look-over. No ID, no phone, nothing. Just the clothes on her back. Ben wheeled the stainless steel gurney to the center of the room. On it lay a sealed black body bag, a stark, final punctuation mark on a life unknown. The routine was as ingrained in Eris as breathing. He stood, his joints protesting with a quiet crackle, and pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. "All right, let's get the preliminary work done. We'll do the full workup in the morning. Get her weighed, measured, and photographed. I want good shots of the face and any identifying marks before she's been on the table too long." Ben nodded, his movements efficient but still tinged with the hesitation of someone who hadn't fully acclimated to the job. He maneuvered the gurney next to the autopsy table, a gleaming slab of metal with gutters running along its edges. Together, they shifted the bag from the gurney to the table. The weight was slight. She was a small woman. Eris could feel the profound, unnatural cold of the body, even through the thick vinyl and his gloves. "Paperwork says EMS worked on her for 20 minutes on site," Ben mentioned, pulling the file from a slot on the gurney. "No pulse, no respiration, fixed and dilated pupils. They called it at 1:47. "Standard procedure," Eris murmured, his eyes scanning the form. It was all depressingly familiar. Another soul lost to the city's indifference and the unforgiving cold. He made a mental note to check the toxicology report for narcotics or alcohol, common contributors in freezing deaths. He turned to a small side table to arrange his instruments, the metallic clink of steel on steel, the only sound for a long moment. "Ready to open her up, Doc?" Ben asked, his hand resting on the bag's heavy-duty zipper. "Go ahead, Ben, let's see who she is." Ben took a breath, a small, unconscious ritual before revealing the face of the deceased. He pulled the zipper tab, and it traced a slow, loud path down the length of the bag. The sound was like a tear in the fabric of the room's silence. As the vinyl parted, the frigid air of the morgue rushed in to meet the even deeper cold of the body within. A plume of faint vapor, like a ghostly breath, rose from the opening. The woman inside was pale, her skin tinged with a faint blue mottling around the lips and fingertips, classic signs of hypothermia. Her dark hair was matted with frost and city grime. She looked young, maybe late 20s, her face peaceful in a way that death rarely afforded its victims. There was a stillness about her that was absolute. Eris moved closer, his professional curiosity overriding the detached weariness he'd felt moments before. "Let's get a core temperature reading now that she's here, and swab her hands for any trace evidence before we clean her up." Ben nodded, reaching for a thermometer probe. He leaned over the table, his focus entirely on his task. He placed one hand gently on her shoulder to steady himself as he prepared to insert the probe. And then it happened. It wasn't violent. It wasn't a sudden jolt or a gasp for air. It was a slow, fluid, and utterly impossible movement. Under the sterile, unwavering lights, the Jane Doe's back arched. Her head lifted from the cold metal. Her eyes, which the paramedics had declared fixed and dilated, fluttered open, unfocused and cloudy. With a silence that was more terrifying than any scream, she sat up. Time seemed to shatter. The hum of the refrigerators vanished. The cold in the room became a living, breathing entity. Ben snatched his hand back as if he'd touched a live wire, stumbling backward until his legs hit a steel counter with a loud clang. A choked, strangled sound escaped his throat, a half sob, half gasp. His face, already pale from the fluorescent lights, turned a ghostly white. Eris froze. His mind, a meticulously organized library of logic, medicine, and procedure, went entirely blank. For a full 3 seconds, all he could do was stare. The woman was sitting upright in the unzipped body bag on his autopsy table. Her head lolled slightly, her gaze vacant, sweeping across the white-tiled room without seeing. She wasn't a corpse anymore. She was a patient. A living person in the last place on Earth she was supposed to be. The silence in the autopsy suite was a physical thing, a crushing weight that pressed in on Eris and Ben. It was thicker than the winter cold, more absolute than the stainless steel and tile that surrounded them. For a full 10 seconds, a lifetime measured in frantic heartbeats, the only movement was the woman. She sat perfectly still, her back ramrod straight, her head slightly bowed, a marble statue carved from ice and disbelief. Her pale, bluish skin seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent light, giving her an ethereal, almost unreal quality. The black body bag was pooled around her waist like a grim shroud she had just shrugged off. Ben made a sound, a choked, guttural gasp that was half scream, half sob. He stumbled backward, his hands flying up to cover his mouth as his heel caught on a floor drain. He hit the tiled wall with a dull thud, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it was primal. He was looking at a ghost, a violation of the natural order he'd been trained to catalog and dissect. That sound, the crack in the suffocating silence, was the catalyst Eris needed. Decades of training, of facing the grim and the unexpected, surged through him like an electric shock, overriding the part of his brain screaming that this was impossible. His mind, a finely honed instrument of medical logic, violently shifted gears. She wasn't Jane Doe, Exhibit A in a hypothermia case anymore. She was a patient, a living patient on his autopsy table. Ben, Eris's voice was a raw bark, a command that cut through the hysteria. Code Blue, now, hit the intercom. Call 911 on your cell, I don't care. Tell them we have a Code Blue in Autopsy Suite 1. Unresponsive female, severe hypothermia, paradoxical undressing. Just get them down here. Ben stared at him, his face a mask of incomprehension. A code? Here? Now, Carter, Eris roared, his voice echoing off the hard surfaces. The fury in his tone finally broke through Ben's paralysis. The younger man scrambled for the wall-mounted intercom, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to press the button. Eris turned his full attention to the woman. He moved with a purpose that defied the surrealism of the moment. His hands, no longer preparing for an incision, were now assessing. He pressed 2 fingers against her carotid artery. It was thready, a faint, slow flutter against the frozen landscape of her skin. A hummingbird's wing beat. Bradycardic. Dangerously so. He peeled back one of her eyelids. The pupil was fixed and dilated, a dark, empty pool, no response. Breathing? He muttered to himself, leaning close to her face, ignoring the icy chill radiating from her skin. He felt it more than he saw it, a shallow, almost imperceptible puff of condensation in the cold air. Agonal respirations, not sustainable. Code Blue, Autopsy 1. Code Blue, Autopsy 1? Ben's panicked voice crackled over the morgue's PA system, a broadcast from a nightmare. He was already on his cell phone, his back to the scene, his voice cracking as he repeated the unbelievable to a 911 dispatcher. "Yes, the morgue. No, I'm not kidding. Just get someone down here." Eris scanned the room, his mind racing. No IV stands, no warming blankets, no defibrillator. This was a room for the dead, completely unequipped for the living. Ben, the paramedics' crash cart. They sometimes leave one by the receiving bay. "Go!" Ben nodded, dropping his phone and bolting from the room, his footsteps pounding down the hallway. Eris was alone with her again. He gently, carefully, tried to ease her back down onto the table. Her body was rigid, stiff with cold, not rigor mortis as he'd assumed, but a profound muscular contraction from the hypothermia. As he laid her flat, the thin hospital gown she wore fell open slightly, revealing the pale expanse of her torso. He had to keep her warm. He grabbed the thick, rubberized body bag she had been in and, fighting a wave of nausea at the sheer wrongness of it all, draped it over her like a blanket. It was a grotesque, desperate improvisation. Seconds later, the double doors to the suite burst open. A resident in blue scrubs, Dr. Ramirez, and two nurses skidded to a halt just inside the doorway, their expressions a mixture of confusion and alarm. They were followed by a panting Ben, who was wrestling a red crash cart through the door. "Eris, what the hell?" Ramirez said, his eyes darting from Eris to the woman on the table, to the body bag serving as a blanket. "They said, code blue in the morgue." "No time," Eris snapped, his authority absolute. "She's alive. Severe hypothermia. We need to warm her now. Get me a line, get the pads on her. Let's go, people." The organized chaos of an emergency response erupted in the most sterile, silent corner of the hospital. The nurses tore open packets, their professional training overriding their shock. One began cutting away the gown, while the other prepped an IV, cursing under her breath at the woman's collapsed veins. Ramirez grabbed the defibrillator paddles as Eris started chest compressions, not because her heart had stopped, but to circulate the freezing blood, to force life back into her limbs. "Her core temp must be in the low 80s, maybe lower," Eris grunted, the rhythm of the compressions steady and forceful. The paramedics must have missed the signal. Lazarus phenomenon. It happens. He was talking as much to convince himself as the others. This wasn't a miracle, it was a rare medical event. It had to be. "IV sin." "Barely," a nurse announced, starting a warmed saline drip. "Her heart rate is 30, Ramirez called out, reading the monitor. "VFib could happen any second as we warm her. We have to get her to the ER." "Get a gurney," Eris commanded. The transfer was a clumsy, frantic ballet. They lifted her, a dead weight that was terrifyingly alive, from the cold steel of the autopsy table to the thin mattress of an ER gurney. As they strapped her in, Eris looked at her face. It was blank, a canvas wiped clean. No identity, no history. Just a biological machine that had refused to shut down. With Ramirez bagging her and a nurse pushing the IV pole, they wheeled her out of the suite at a run. The squeak of the gurney wheels and the frantic shouting faded down the corridor, leaving an abrupt, echoing silence in their wake. Eris and Ben stood alone in the room. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and adrenaline. The red crash cart stood abandoned, its drawers open, sterile wrappers littering the floor like confetti after a funeral. On the steel table, a faint, wet outline marked where the woman had lain. The empty, unzipped body bag lay crumpled beside it, a discarded skin. Ben finally looked at Eris, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "Eris, we were about to cut into her." Eris leaned heavily against the autopsy table, the cold of the steel seeping through his scrubs. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a tremor in his hands and an icy dread that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. He looked at the scalpel tray, at the gleaming instruments they had laid out. The reality of what had almost happened and what had just occurred crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't over. It had just begun. The swinging doors of the autopsy suite hissed shut, cutting off the receding echoes of the gurney's rattling wheels and the urgent, clipped voices of the emergency team. Silence, thick and suffocating, fell upon Autopsy Room 4. It was a different kind of quiet than the one Eris was used to. Not the sterile, respectful peace of the dead, but the ringing void left behind by a storm. The air, usually crisp with the scent of disinfectant, was now heavy with the metallic tang of fear and the humid warmth of living, breathing bodies that had packed the space moments before. Ben stood frozen by the instrument tray, his knuckles white where he gripped the stainless steel edge. His face, normally a healthy olive tone, was ashen, drained of all color. He stared at the empty gurney, at the damp, wrinkled outline on the plastic sheet where the woman had lain. Discarded packaging from IV lines, electrode pads, and a laryngoscope lay scattered on the floor like refuse after a frantic, desperate party. Eris, Ben's voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible. What just happened? Eris Thorne felt a tremor in his own hands and forced them into the pockets of his scrubs to still them. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, a wild rhythm that belied his calm exterior. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the air burning his lungs. What just happened, Ben, is that we almost performed an autopsy on a living person. The bluntness of the statement seemed to shatter the last of Ben's composure. He finally let go of the tray and stumbled back, his eyes wide with a terror that was pure and primal. Oh God, oh my God, we're finished. Eris, we're fired, at best. They'll take our licenses. We could go to jail. Negligence, malpractice, my wife, my kids. He started pacing, a caged animal in the sterile, tiled room, his hands running through his hair. Stop it, Eris said, his voice sharper than he intended. Ben froze, looking at him with wounded eyes. Eris softened his tone. Panicking is a luxury we don't have right now. It won't help us. It won't help her. Help her? We were about to cut her open. I had the scalpel in my hand, Eris. Ben pointed a trembling finger at the gleaming number 10 blade resting on the tray, a silent, silver accusation. If you hadn't hesitated. But I did hesitate, Eris interrupted, his gaze locking onto Ben's. And we didn't. That single fact is the only thing standing between us and complete ruin. Now, we have to control what happens next. Eris walked over to his workstation, his movements stiff. He pulled up the Jane Doe's initial intake file on his computer. The screen's glow illuminated the exhaustion etched onto his face. The paramedics from CFD Engine 42. They brought her in, pronounced her in the field. We need their report. We need the name of the physician who signed off on the declaration at the scene. They'll just blame us, Ben choked out, sinking onto a stool. They'll say we didn't do our due diligence. And did we? Eris asked quietly, not looking away from the screen. He scrolled through the sparse notes. Found in alley, rear of 180 block of N. Clybourne. No ID, apparent hypothermia. We checked for vitals, Ben. No pulse, no respiration. I checked her pupils myself. Fixed and dilated. Her core temperature was, what was it? So low it didn't register on the first thermometer, Ben mumbled, recalling the routine check. We had to use the low-reading thermocouple. It read 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Eris nodded slowly. Lazarus syndrome. It's incredibly rare, but severe hypothermia can mimic death. It slows the heart and respiration to undetectable levels. You're not dead until you're warm and dead. Every first-year medical student learns it. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had learned it, recited it, and yet here he was. The textbook case had just sat up on his table. The piercing ring of the wall-mounted phone made both men jump. They stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. After the third ring, Eris pushed himself up and answered, his voice a strained, professional monotone. Medical examiner's office, Dr. Thorne speaking. He listened, his expression unreadable. He made a few notes on a pad, his writing tight and precise. Understood. Yes, Dr. Ramirez. Thank you for the update. He hung up the phone and turned to face Ben. That was the ER, Eris said. She's in the ICU. They've got her on a warming blanket and a cardiopulmonary bypass to warm her blood. Her core temp is up to 85. She's still comatose, in critical condition, but her vitals are stable. He paused, letting the information sink in. She's alive, for now. Ben buried his face in his hands. The news that she was alive wasn't a relief, it was a confirmation of their nightmare. A dead patient was a tragedy. A patient they almost killed was a catastrophe. "There's only one thing to do now," Eris said, his resolve hardening. He walked out of the autopsy suite and down the quiet, sterile hallway to his small, cluttered office. The familiar comfort of his books and case files offered no solace. Every diploma on the wall seemed to mock him. He sat behind his desk and looked at the nameplate on his phone. Dr. Lena Petrova, Chief Medical Examiner. A woman known for her sharp intellect and even sharper tongue, who tolerated no mistakes and suffered no fools. A mistake of this magnitude was unheard of, career-ending not just for him, but for her, for the entire office. He knew what this call would unleash. A full-scale investigation, media scrutiny, lawyers. The end of the quiet, orderly life he had built for himself in the service of the dead. He thought of the woman in the ICU, fighting for a life everyone thought she had already lost. He thought of the paramedics who had signed her death certificate. He thought of Ben, a good man with a family whose life was about to be turned upside down. There was no other way. Hiding it was impossible and, more importantly, wrong. The system had failed, and he was at the end of that chain of failure. He had a duty to the woman, to his profession, to the truth, no matter how damaging. With a hand that felt impossibly heavy, Eris Thorne picked up the receiver, the cool plastic a stark contrast to his clammy skin. He took one last, steadying breath and dialed the number. As he listened to the ring on the other end, he braced himself for the storm. "Lena, it's Eris. We have a situation down here, a serious one." The silence after Eris hung up the phone was heavier than any he'd ever experienced in the morgue. It was a dense, suffocating quiet, filled not with the peace of the departed, but with the frantic ticking of a clock counting down to his own professional demise. Ben was pacing, his rubber-soled shoes squeaking a frantic rhythm on the polished concrete floor. He was wringing his hands, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat that mirrored the sterile sheen of the stainless steel tables. "She's going to fire us," Ben whispered, the words barely audible. "God, Eris, she's going to fire us and we'll never work in the city again, or any city." "Breathe, Ben," Eris said, his own voice sounding distant, detached. He was leaning against a counter, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, a futile attempt to hold himself together. "Panic won't help. We stick to the facts. A mistake was made in the field. We were the last line of defense, and the system failed." He was trying to frame it institutionally, a systemic breakdown, but the words felt hollow. He had unzipped that bag. He had been ready to make the first cut. The double doors to the autopsy suite swung open with a force that made both men jump. Dr. Lena Petrova stood in the doorway, and the air temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She was a woman carved from granite and ambition, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal pantsuit that looked more suited for a boardroom than a basement morgue. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, the color of storm clouds, swept the room with an unnerving intensity, missing nothing. They landed on the empty autopsy table where Jane Doe had been, then moved to Ben, and finally settled on Eris with crushing weight. "Thorne," she said, her voice low and devoid of any warmth. "My office. Now, Carter, you stay here. Don't touch anything. Don't talk to anyone." Ben froze, nodding mutely, looking like a frightened child. Eris pushed himself off the counter and followed Petrova, his feet feeling like lead blocks. Her office was on the main floor, a stark, minimalist space that reflected its occupant. She didn't invite him to sit. She stood behind her large mahogany desk, her hands clasped behind her back, fixing him with a stare that felt like a physical interrogation. "Walk me through it," she commanded, from the moment the body arrived. Eris recounted the events, his voice steady and clinical, channeling the years of delivering dispassionate testimony in courtrooms. He detailed the paperwork from the paramedics, the stated cause of death as hypothermia, the routine preparations. He described the moment the bag was opened, the impossible, horrifying movement. "And your preliminary check, Eris, before you open the bag?" Petrova's question was a scalpel, aimed at the heart of the matter. Did you verify for rigor? For livor mortis? Did you check for a pulse yourself? Eris felt a flush of heat crawl up his neck. The declaration was made by licensed paramedics, Lena. She was frozen solid. Core temperature was unreadably low on their equipment. In cases of severe hypothermia, vital signs can be undetectable. It's called the cold water drowning phenomenon. You're not dead until you're warm and dead. I was proceeding under the assumption the field diagnosis was correct. Assumptions get people buried alive, Eris, she shot back, her voice cutting through his clinical defense. They get medical examiners disbarred, and they get my office sued into oblivion. Who were the paramedics? Mike Rask and Dave Chen, Eris said, the names coming from the intake form he'd memorized just an hour ago. Petrova made a note on a pad. Their chief will hear from me before the hour is out. They're off the street, pending this investigation. She looked up, her gaze hardening further. And so are you. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Hand over your access card and your keys. Carter, too. The words hit Eris harder than a physical blow. 22 years in this office. This building was more of a home to him than his own empty apartment. Lena, I reported it. I did the right thing the moment I knew. The right thing would have been to verify death before you brought a scalpel anywhere near a living patient. She snapped, her composure finally cracking to reveal a deep, simmering fury. Do you have any idea the storm that is about to break over us? The media, the state medical board, the mayor's office. This isn't just a mistake, Eris. This is the kind of catastrophic failure that ends careers. Plural. She took a deep, steadying breath, regaining her icy control. Go home, Eris. Don't talk to the press. Don't talk to your colleagues. Don't even think about this office. A formal investigative committee will be convened. You will be summoned to give a full, sworn statement. Until then, you are a ghost. He nodded, defeated. There was nothing more to say. He placed his ID card and the ring of keys on the corner of her desk. The metallic clink sounded like a final judgment. He turned and walked out, not looking back. He found Ben still standing sentinel in the morgue, looking lost. We're on leave, Eris said quietly. Give me your card. Ben's face crumpled. I have a kid on the way, Eris. My wife. I know, Ben, Eris said, his voice softer now, the shared disaster forming a fragile bond between them. Go home, be with your wife. We don't say anything to anyone. We just wait. He took Ben's card and walked back to Petrova's office, placing it silently beside his own. He left the building through a side entrance, stepping out into the biting Chicago wind. The cold that had nearly killed Jane Doe now felt like a cruel joke, a citywide accomplice to his ruin. The ordinary sounds of traffic and sirens seemed alien, a world he was no longer a part of. He was a ghost now, just as she had ordered. The biting wind that had terrorized Chicago for 2 days had finally relented, leaving behind a city draped in an unnaturally pristine blanket of white. Inside the overheated break room of Firehouse 51, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and exhaustion. Paramedic Mike Kowalski leaned back in a plastic chair, the vinyl groaning in protest, and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. Every muscle ached. Across from him, his partner, Dave Chen, scrolled silently through his phone, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. They'd been running calls for 36 hours straight. A brutal shift defined by frostbite, carbon monoxide alarms, and fender benders on icy streets. The Jane Doe in the alley off Wabash had been their last call before the blizzard broke, and their worst. Mike could still feel the profound, frozen stillness of her body, the waxy texture of her skin that didn't yield to the touch. No pulse, no respiration, pupils fixed and dilated. Classic signs. They had done everything by the book. The door opened, and Captain Eva Rostova stepped in. A woman whose small frame belied a commanding presence, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her gaze, sharp and serious, landed on them both. Kowalski, Chen, my office. Mike and Dave exchanged a nervous glance. This wasn't typical. Debriefs happened, but not like this, not with that tone. They followed her down the hall into a small, cluttered office dominated by a large city map covered in pins. She closed the door behind them. "Got a call from the chief medical examiner's office an hour ago," Rostova began, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "About the Jane Doe you brought in this morning, the hypothermia case from the alley." Mike's stomach tightened. "What about her?" Rostova leaned against her desk, her arms crossed. "She's not a Jane Doe anymore, and she's not in the morgue. She's in the ICU at Cook County General. She's alive." The words hung in the air, dense and suffocating. Dave let out a small, choked sound. Mike felt the blood drain from his face, a cold dread creeping up his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "Alive? Captain, that's impossible. We checked. We followed protocol to the letter. No vitals for over 20 minutes. The cold, it can mimic death, but..." He trailed off, the excuses sounding weak even to him. "I'm not here to debate physiology with you, Mike," Rostova cut in, her tone hardening. "I'm here to tell you the facts. The ME's office initiated a code blue in the autopsy suite. The woman is in a coma, but she is alive, which means you declared a living person dead." Dave finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. We did everything right. The conditions were, it was a blizzard." "I know the conditions," Rostova said, her gaze softening for just a moment. "But a mistake of this magnitude, it doesn't just go away. Dr. Petrova at the ME's office has launched a full-scale investigation. There will be a formal review committee. The Chicago PD is involved now, trying to identify her, figure out what happened." She paused, letting the weight of her next words land. "Effective immediately, you are both on paid administrative leave pending the outcome of this investigation. You'll turn in your radios and keys. Go home. Don't talk to anyone about this. A union rep will be in contact." The procedural coldness of the order was a slap in the face. Mike felt a surge of anger, then despair. His entire career, 20 years of it, was flashing before his eyes. He had made the call. He was the senior paramedic. It was his fault. 30 miles away, in a quiet, sterile apartment in Lincoln Park, Dr. Eris Thorne stood staring out the window at the snow-covered trees. The silence was absolute. After years of working amidst the constant hum of ventilation systems, the clatter of steel instruments, and the low murmur of dictated reports, the quiet of his own home felt alien and oppressive. He had been stripped of his purpose. Petrova's words echoed in his mind, a relentless loop of accusation. "You are the final checkpoint, Eris. You!" He ran a hand through his hair, his movements agitated. He'd spent the morning trying to distract himself, organizing his medical library, a task he usually found soothing, then attempting to read a new article in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. But the words blurred on the page, replaced by the image of the woman's slow, deliberate movement as she sat up on his table. His professional identity, meticulously built over a decade, felt like a house of cards in a hurricane. He was a man of science, of process, of certainty. Death was his specialty because it was an absolute. There was no ambiguity, no gray area. Until now. Now, he was the man who had almost performed an autopsy on a living person. The thought sent a wave of nausea through him. He paced the length of his living room, the polished hardwood floors cool beneath his bare feet. He felt a desperate need to do something, to review the paperwork, to talk to the ER doctors, to understand the patient's condition. But he was locked out. His access to the county system had been revoked before he'd even left the building. He was a ghost in his own professional life, haunting the edges of a disaster he had failed to prevent. He checked his phone for the 10th time in an hour, hoping for, what? An update. A reprieve? There was only an automated email from HR confirming his administrative leave. Its bureaucratic language, a cold, impersonal finality. He was alone, adrift in a sea of his own making, waiting for the storm to fully break. In the sterile, beeping environment of the Cook County General Hospital's intensive care unit, two men in rumpled suits stood looking through a glass window at the woman who had brought two city departments to a grinding halt. She lay motionless in the bed. A tangle of wires and tubes connecting her to a symphony of monitors that tracked every fragile breath and heartbeat. "So that's her," said Detective Miller, the younger of the two, jotting a note in his small pad. "Jane Doe, lucky to be alive." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Detective Harding replied, his voice a low grumble. He was a 20-year veteran with tired eyes that had seen the worst of Chicago. "Sheer, dumb, impossible chance. One more degree colder, one more minute in that alley, one more competent paramedic, and she's just another file." Miller looked at his partner. "You think the paramedics screwed up?" "I think a woman doesn't end up frozen solid in an alley behind a Michelin star restaurant by accident," Harding said, his gaze fixed on the patient. No coat, no purse, no phone. Dressed for a night out. This wasn't some homeless person who succumbed to the elements. This was something else. Somebody left her there. He turned from the window. "I want uniforms canvassing every business in a 4-block radius of that alley. Show her photo around. Check security footage. Run her prints again. We need a name. Without a name, we don't have a history. Without a history, we don't have a motive." "You think it's attempted murder?" Miller asked. Harding finally looked at him, a grin set to his jaw. "In this city, son, when a woman turns up like this, you don't start by assuming it was an accident. You start by looking for the person who wanted her dead." The interview room at the 18th District Station was a study in beige monotony. Beige walls, beige table, uncomfortable plastic chairs that were also, inexplicably, beige. Detective Harding dropped a thin file onto the table, the sound unnaturally loud in the small, sound-dampened space. Across from him and his partner, Detective Miller, sat Mike Kowalski and Dave Chen. The paramedics looked exhausted, their uniforms crisp, but their faces etched with a tension that went beyond a normal stressful shift. They had been separated, interviewed individually, and now brought together for a final review. It was classic procedure. "Let's go over it one more time from the top," Harding said, his tone flat, betraying no emotion. He wasn't accusing them, not yet. He was building a foundation. "You get the call. A possible DOA in an alley off Rush Street. Walk me through it." Mike, the senior of the two, took the lead. "Call came in around 0300. Dispatch said a sanitation worker spotted a body. We arrived on scene. Alley was dark, cold as a witch's. Well, it was cold. Maybe 10, 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind was kicking up something fierce." Miller, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward slightly. "And the woman, what was her position when you found her?" Dave spoke up, his voice softer than Mike's. "She was wedged between a dumpster and the brick wall. On her side, fetal position, minimal clothing. A thin dress, no coat. Looked like she'd been out there for a while. Skin was ice cold to the touch, waxy. Classic signs of severe, prolonged hypothermia." "So you began your assessment," Harding prompted, his eyes fixed on Mike. "That's right," Mike confirmed, his jaw tight. "We checked for vitals. No discernible pulse at the carotid or radial arteries. I put the stethoscope to her chest, listened for a good minute. Nothing, no breath sounds, no chest rise or fall. Dave checked her pupils, fixed and dilated. No response to light. Did you use the cardiac monitor?" Miller asked. "Of course," Dave said, a defensive edge to his voice. "We hooked up the pads. The monitor showed asystole, a flat line. We ran the strip, no electrical activity. By every metric in our protocol, she was deceased. Core temperature was probably so low her heart had just stopped." Harding tapped a pen on the file. "And you're confident in that reading? No electrical interference. The cold doesn't mess with the equipment?" "We check our gear constantly," Mike insisted. "It's rated for these conditions. Look, detective, we've been doing this a combined 25 years. We've pronounced dozens of people. We know what death looks like. And that woman, she was gone. We followed our training to the letter." "Nobody is saying you didn't," Harding said calmly. "But she wasn't gone, was she? She sat up on a slab in the morgue. So somewhere a mistake was made. We're trying to find out where." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations. The paramedics knew their careers were hanging by a thread, just like Eris's. They had been the first domino. Across town, in the suffocating quiet of his Lincoln Park apartment, Eris Thorne stared at his phone. The screen illuminated the name and number he'd gotten from a colleague. Brenda Walsh, AFSCME Union Representative. His finger hovered over the call button. He felt like a fraud. He was a man of science, of empirical evidence. Now he was dialing a union rep like a factory worker about to be fired. The indignity of it was a bitter pill, but the fear was worse. Petrova's cold fury, the image of Ben's terrified face, the silent accusation in every corner of his home, it was all closing in. He pressed the button. It rang 3 times before a woman with a gravelly, no-nonsense voice answered. Walsh, yes, hello, my name is Dr. Eris Thorne. I was given your number. I'm a medical examiner with the Cook County office. I know who you are, Dr. Thorne, Brenda said, her voice devoid of sympathy. I've been expecting your call. You're on administrative leave. The morgue incident. Eris's throat went dry. Yes, that's right. I don't know what to do. They're investigating. Dr. Petrova, listen to me very carefully, Brenda cut in, her tone sharp as broken glass. You do nothing, you say nothing, to anyone. Not your colleagues, not your friends, and especially not the police if they come knocking. You refer everyone to me. Have you been formally interviewed yet? By Dr. Petrova, yes. Not the police. Good, keep it that way. Write down everything that happened, every single detail, from the moment that body bag came into your suite. Timelines, conversations, procedures. Write it for me, not for them. Are we clear? Yes, but no buts, doctor. You're in a storm. My job is to be your umbrella. Your only job right now is to stay quiet and let me work. I'll be in touch. The line went dead. Eris lowered the phone, the silence of the apartment rushing back in. He didn't feel better. He didn't feel protected. He just felt like a numbered case file, his fate now in the hands of a stranger with a gruff voice. Back at the hospital, Jane Doe remained a ghost in a machine. She lay still in the ICU bed, her breathing maintained by a ventilator, her vitals a steady, rhythmic dance on the monitor beside her. A nurse named Sarah, young but meticulous, was on her 3rd consecutive shift watching over the unidentified woman. She moved with quiet efficiency, checking IV lines, adjusting the thermal blanket, and performing the routine tasks of patient care. As she was gently cleaning the patient's hands, she noticed something the ER team had missed in their frantic rush. The woman's left wrist bore the faint, pale outline of where a watch had been worn for a long time. Just below that line, almost hidden in a crease of the skin, was a tiny, dark blue tattoo. It was no bigger than a dime. Sarah leaned closer, her brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't a random shape or a letter. It was intricate, stylized. A tiny, detailed rendering of a northern cardinal, its crest sharp, its beak precise, perched on a nearly invisible branch. It was subtle, easily overlooked, but undeniably deliberate. It was a mark of identity. She straightened up, her heart beating a little faster. It was the first thing about this woman that wasn't a medical chart or a mystery. It was personal. Pulling off her gloves, she walked over to the nurse's station, her expression serious. She picked up the phone and asked to be connected to the detectives assigned to Jane Doe's case. It was a small detail, a tiny bird inked on a wrist, but in the vast emptiness of the investigation, it was everything. The cardinal tattoo was their last, best hope. Detective Harding stood before a small scrum of local news reporters outside the 18th District Station, the February wind whipping at his coat. He kept it brief, professional. They had a Jane Doe, a survivor, found in a near North Side alley. He described her approximate age and build, then held up a clear, high-resolution photo of the small, crimson bird inked onto the inside of a pale wrist. "This tattoo is unique," Harding said, his voice firm against the city's noise. "If you recognize it, if you know a woman who went missing 2 nights ago who has this mark, please call the number on your screen." He didn't hold out much hope, but in Chicago, you used every tool you had. You threw a message in a bottle into the vast, churning sea of the city and prayed someone found it. Less than 3 hours later, someone did. The call came into the precinct, routed to Miller's desk. The voice on the other end was trembling, a woman named Sarah. "I saw it on the news, the tattoo," she stammered, her words punctuated by choked-back sobs. "My sister, Clara. I gave her that for her 25th birthday. It's a cardinal for our grandmother. Clara Hayes, she had a name." The story Sarah tearfully pieced together for the detectives was tragically simple, devoid of the sinister conspiracy they had initially suspected. Clara had been laid off from her graphic design job a week prior. It had hit her hard. The night she disappeared, she'd had a bitter argument with her boyfriend and had gone to a bar in River North to be alone. She wasn't a heavy drinker, but that night, she was distraught. Bank records confirmed she'd paid her tab around midnight. After that, she was a ghost. There was no abduction, no assault. The most likely scenario, Harding and Miller concluded, was that a heartbroken and intoxicated Clara had gotten disoriented in the brutal cold. She'd stumbled into the alley for shelter from the wind, her body temperature dropping catastrophically until the cold induced a state so close to death it had fooled everyone. With no crime to investigate, the detectives closed their case file and forwarded their findings to the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. The report landed on Dr. Lena Petrova's desk like a final piece of a complex puzzle. 2 days later, Eris Thorne's phone rang. It was Petrova's assistant, her voice stripped of all emotion. "Dr. Petrova requests your presence for a final review tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. conference room 3 billion. Mr. Carter has been notified, as have paramedics Kowalski and Chen." The call ended. There was no room for questions. Eris hung up, the silence in his apartment suddenly feeling heavy, suffocating. He walked into conference room 3 billion the next morning to a scene of grim anticipation. Ben sat hunched in a chair, looking younger and more terrified than ever. Across the polished table, Mike Kowalski and Dave Chen sat stiffly, their faces etched with the anxiety of the past week. They all looked up as Eris entered, a silent acknowledgement of their shared ordeal passing between them. A moment later, Dr. Petrova entered, carrying a single manila folder. She closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing like a gavel. She didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, her gaze sweeping over each of them. "The police investigation is closed," she began, her tone clinical. "The patient, identified as Clara Hayes, is alive. The circumstances leading to her condition have been deemed a tragic personal incident, not a criminal act. That leaves us with the internal matter of procedural failure." She opened the folder. "Paramedics Kowalski and Chen," she said, her eyes locking onto them. "Your field assessment was compromised by extreme environmental factors. However, the protocols for severe hypothermia are clear. You missed the faint electrical activity of the heart. This was a grave error." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "You will both be suspended without pay for an additional 30 days. Upon your return, you will undergo mandatory recertification, training focusing on hypothermia assessment and field diagnostics. Another failure of this magnitude will result in your immediate termination. Do you understand?" Kowalski and Chen nodded, a visible wave of relief washing over their strained features. It was harsh, but it wasn't the end. Petrova's gaze shifted to Ben. "Mr. Carter, as a technician, you operate under the direction of the medical examiner. While you bear responsibility for your part in the chain of events, your role was subordinate. You followed Dr. Thorne's lead. A formal letter of reprimand will be placed in your permanent file. You are cleared to return to duty effective immediately." Ben let out a shaky breath he seemed to have been holding for a week, nodding his thanks. Finally, she looked at Eris. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of cold professionalism. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "of everyone in that room, you hold the highest degree of responsibility. You are the final checkpoint. You were the last line of defense against a catastrophic mistake, and you failed to perform that check. You accepted the field declaration without personal verification. There is no excuse for that lapse. It is a fundamental breach of the trust placed in you." Eris met her gaze, his own heart a cold knot in his chest. This was it. However, Petrova continued, and the entire room seemed to lean in. When the unthinkable happened, your actions were exemplary. Your training took over. You initiated a code blue in a setting unprepared for one and directed the initial response that, according to the ER chief, undoubtedly saved Miss Hayes' life. You turned an indefensible error into a life-saving intervention. She closed the folder. Your administrative leave is terminated. You are reinstated. A formal, severe reprimand will be recorded in your file. For the next 6 months, you will be on probationary status. Every case you handle will be subject to secondary review. You, Dr. Thorne, will personally draft and implement a new mandatory intake protocol for all cases declared in the field, specifically addressing hypothermia. You will teach it to every technician on staff. She held his gaze. You made a terrible mistake, doctor, but you also saved a life. Do not ever let the former overshadow the latter, and do not ever forget the lesson it taught you. An immense, crushing weight lifted from Eris's shoulders. It wasn't a pardon. It was a second chance, scarred but whole. A month later, the Chicago winter had finally begun to loosen its icy grip. Eris was back in the morgue, the familiar scent of antiseptic, a strange comfort. He moved with a new deliberateness, a caution that was now second nature. On his desk was the new protocol checklist, laminated, its final item in bold. Personal vitals verification by attending ME is mandatory prior to autopsy prep. No exceptions. His phone buzzed. It was Ben calling from the break room. Eris, you here? I just talked to a buddy over at Northwestern Memorial. What is it, Ben? It's Clara Hayes. She woke up 2 days ago. Doctors say she has amnesia about the event, but her cognitive functions are returning. She's going to make a full recovery. Eris closed his eyes. That's good news, Ben. Thank you for telling me. He hung up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. The line between life and death had never seemed so thin, so fragile. He had nearly crossed it for someone else. But in the end, in the sterile silence of the autopsy room, a life wasn't taken. It was given back. And in that, Eris Thorne found his own form of redemption.